Nadia found out on a Tuesday. Not from Kale, not from anyone who owed her the truth. She found out the way women always find out about the things meant to replace them, from a detail so small it almost did not register. A coffee mug on the counter of the packhouse kitchen. White ceramic, no handle. Not hers. She had never seen it before. She picked it up, turned it over, set it back down, and went on with her morning as if her hands had not just gone cold. That was 3 weeks ago. Now she stood in the same kitchen, earlier than usual, because she had not been able to sleep past 4 in the morning for the past month. The packhouse was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful. It feels like something holding its breath. She made her tea the way she always made it. 2 spoons, no sugar. She stood at the window and watched the first gray light come up over the tree line, and she let herself think about nothing at all, which was the one skill she had perfected over the past year. Her name was Nadia Cole. She was 27 years old. She had lived in the Ashford Pack territory since she was 19, when she had arrived as a transfer from a smaller pack in the north, carrying 2 bags and a letter of introduction from her former alpha that described her as capable and dependable and not likely to cause problems. She had read the letter herself, because the alpha had not sealed it properly, and she had decided then that those were the words a man used when he could not bring himself to say remarkable. She had made herself useful here. That was the honest version of her story. She had learned the territory, learned the politics, learned the names of every elder and every council member and every visiting dignitary who passed through. She had worked in the PAC's administrative office for 3 years before Kale, Alpha Kale Drayton, had promoted her to his personal advisory staff. That was 4 years ago. 4 years. She finished her tea and rinsed the mug and dried her hands on the small towel hanging from the oven door, and she thought about those 4 years the way you think about a road you have already driven down. You remember the turns. You remember which stretches were smooth, and which ones shook the car, but the road itself is already behind you, and the distance does not shrink no matter how long you stare at the rearview mirror. She had not been removed from her position. That was the important thing to understand about her situation, and she had repeated it to herself many times in the past 3 weeks, the way you repeat something you are not entirely sure you believe. She was still on staff. She still attended morning briefings. She still prepared the council summaries and coordinated with the border patrol leaders and sat in on diplomatic correspondence with the 3 neighboring packs. Nothing had been taken from her in any formal, announced way. She had simply been moved to the side. The mugs started appearing 2 months before that, or, more precisely, 1 mug appeared, and then the woman attached to it began appearing in rooms that Nadia had always previously occupied alone with Kale and the senior staff. Her name was Alara Voss. She was 24. She had come to the pack as a liaison from the Voss family, which was one of the oldest and most politically significant bloodlines in the entire Northern Territory. She was slender and soft-spoken and had hair the color of very dark honey, and she listened when people talked in a way that made people feel they had said something important. Nadia had liked her immediately. That was the part of this story she had no clean way to explain to anyone. She had genuinely liked Alara, had found her to be warm and intelligent, and far less pretentious than the Voss name had prepared Nadia to expect. They had spoken easily at the first meeting, over a long conference table covered in border maps, and Alara had asked good questions and taken careful notes, and had not tried to perform her importance the way so many liaison representatives did. Nadia had walked back to her office that evening thinking, simply, that this was going to be a productive working relationship. She had not understood then what Alara's presence actually meant, or perhaps she had, and had refused to look at it directly. The shift happened slowly enough that no single moment could be named as the turning point. Kale had always been a contained man, not cold but measured. He did not wear his feelings in an obvious way. He had a particular quality of attention that he gave to things that mattered to him, a kind of focused stillness, and Nadia had spent 4 years learning to read it. She knew when he was troubled. She knew when he was relieved. She knew the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking and the silence that meant the conversation was over. She noticed when that quality of attention began to settle, gradually, on someone else. She noticed the way Alara's name appeared first on the briefing schedule. She noticed that when Alara offered an opinion in a meeting, Kale did not simply consider it. He received it, nodded slowly in that particular way of his. She noticed that Alara was now joining the evening strategy sessions that had always been small, inner circle gatherings. She noticed that her own reports were still being read, she could tell from the margin notes, but that the follow-up questions had thinned, as if the decisions were being made in another room before they reached her desk. None of this was said out loud. No one told her she was being sidelined. No one sat her down and explained the situation. She simply began to experience the particular loneliness of being present while also being, in some essential way, no longer seen. She pressed on, because that was what she did. She arrived on time, she completed everything asked of her, she offered her analysis clearly and without visible bitterness. And she went home in the evenings and sat with the quiet of her apartment, and told herself she was fine. Told herself that positions shifted. Told herself that the arrival of a significant political figure like Alara naturally reshaped the internal dynamics of the pack. Told herself all of this, in the careful, reasonable language of a woman who had decided that surviving with dignity was the same as being okay. There was a version of herself that was angry. She knew it was there. She had felt it late at night, when sleep would not come, in the form of a heat behind her sternum that had no name she was willing to give it. It was not anger at Alara, who had done nothing wrong. It was not even entirely anger at Kale, who had made no promises to her that she could point to. It was something older than that, heavier, the specific weight of a woman who has made herself extraordinary in all the quiet ways that no one sees, and then watched the room reorganize itself around something else entirely. She did not let herself sit with that feeling for long. She had not been raised to dwell. She packed it down the way you pack a wound, firmly, without flinching. And she got up the next morning and she went to work. The morning the mating announcement was made official, she was in her office when she heard the sound move through the building. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the air. The particular shift in energy that a piece of news creates when it spreads through a place where people know each other well. She heard doors open. She heard voices in the hallway rise and then drop into murmuring. She heard someone laugh in the way people laugh when they are not sure how they feel but the situation calls for a response. She already knew what it was before she opened her office door. She stood in the doorway and listened to Marcus, one of the younger administrative staff, telling someone 3 feet away from her that the Alpha had declared his intention to take a mate from the Voss line, that the formal ceremony was being scheduled, that it was, in his words, and he said this with the wholehearted certainty of a 22-year-old who had never needed to think carefully about what he was saying, a perfect match, the best possible thing for the pack, exactly what everyone had been expecting. He said those last words and he turned and he saw Nadia standing in her doorway and his face did something complicated. She gave him a small, even smile, the kind of smile that does not reach past the corners of your mouth but is nonetheless perfectly correct for the situation. "Good morning, Marcus," she said. "Good morning," he said. She went back into her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk. She placed both hands flat on the surface of it, and she breathed, slowly and very deliberately, for approximately 30 seconds. The desk was oak. She had chosen it herself when she moved into this office 4 years ago, and she had sanded a small rough patch on the left corner herself with a square of sandpaper she had borrowed from the maintenance room and never returned. She looked at that corner now. She put her finger on it, and felt the smooth place where the grain had been evened out. She was fine. She was absolutely fine. She had an 11 o'clock briefing. She pulled up the report she had spent the previous afternoon compiling, and she read through it once for errors, and then she read through it again, because the first time she had not actually absorbed a single word. She fixed a minor formatting issue in the 4th paragraph. She printed 2 copies. At 10:55 she walked to the briefing room with both copies, and she arranged them on the table, and she sat in her usual chair, and she waited. Kale came in at 11 exactly, which was what he always did. He was tall in the way that large men sometimes are, not aggressively but inescapably. You were always aware of the amount of room he moved through. He had dark hair cut short and a face that people often described as serious, though Nadia had always thought serious was not quite right. It was not that he lacked warmth. It was that he kept it in a place that required a certain amount of time and proximity to reach. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that changed quality in different light, and she had noticed this many times without ever once allowing herself to think about the fact that she had noticed. He sat. He picked up the report. He read through it with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. He did not mention the announcement. She did not mention it either. They went through the briefing point by point. He asked 3 questions. She answered them. He made one suggestion about the border schedule that she had already considered and had a counter-argument for, and she gave him that counter-argument clearly. And he listened to it and said, after a moment, "You're right. Keep it as drafted." That was all. She walked out of the briefing room at 11:40, and she did not look back. She told herself, on the walk back to her office, that this was manageable, that professional life and personal life were 2 separate territories, and she had always been good at keeping them clearly divided, that she was going to be fine, that in a week this would feel normal, that in a month she would have adjusted entirely. She believed approximately half of this. She spent the afternoon finalizing the correspondence that had been waiting on her desk for 2 days, and she ate lunch at her desk because she did not particularly want to eat in the common room, where people were still, she could hear through the walls, discussing the announcement with the energized delight of people who love any kind of occasion. She heard Alara's name spoken warmly by at least 4 different voices. She heard the words beautiful and elegant and perfect. She ate her sandwich. She went home that evening as the sun was going down, which it did early now because it was late autumn, and the days had pulled in like a held breath. The leaves on the trees along the main path had gone from amber to rust to the particular dark brown of the very end of the season, the point when the beauty has finished but the falling has not yet stopped. She walked through them. She put her hands in her coat pockets. Her apartment was small and tidy and smelled like the candle she had lit that morning before leaving. She hung her coat. She took off her shoes. She sat on the edge of her bed and she looked at the wall for a while, not really seeing it. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She let herself feel it. Not all of it. She was not sure she was ready for all of it. But she let herself feel the shape of the thing. The particular loneliness of having built herself carefully and completely around a purpose that had, without anyone intending it, been quietly removed. The weight of having shown up every single day and given her best thinking and her clearest judgment and her most careful work, and of having had all of that received gratefully and valued, and then, simply, deprioritized in favor of something that had nothing to do with the quality of her work. She sat with that for a long time. And then she got up. She washed her face. She made dinner. She went to bed. Because this was the truth about Nadia Cole. The truth that no one in the pack house knew, because she had never given anyone the opportunity to see it. She was not a woman who broke. She had been tested in that way before, earlier and harder than most people would guess from looking at her calm, composed surface. She had already learned, at a cost she never discussed, that the only way through something difficult was to keep moving forward at a pace that the grief could not quite catch. She would keep moving. The question, the one she had not answered yet, lying in the dark at the end of that long, strange day, was what, exactly, she was moving toward. She did not know. Not yet. But she got up the next morning at 5, because sleep had failed her again, and she went to the kitchen and she made her tea, and she stood at the window and watched the gray light return, and she thought, one more day. That was enough for now. One more day. The invitations went out on a Friday. Nadia saw hers on the side table by the building entrance, tucked between a supply delivery notice and a memo about the winter schedule, a cream envelope with her name written on it in a formal hand. She picked it up and put it in her coat pocket without opening it, the way you handle something you already know the contents of but are not quite ready to read. She opened it that evening, at home, standing at the kitchen counter. The paper inside was thick and cream-colored, the kind used for things people want to feel permanent. The Ashford Pack crest was embossed at the top. Below it, in clean, even text, was the formal announcement of the mating ceremony between Alpha Cale Drayton and Alara Voss of the Northern Voss line. The date was 3 weeks away. The ceremony would be held at the main gathering hall. Attendance for all senior staff was expected. Nadia set the invitation on the counter. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to make dinner. The next morning she arrived at work before anyone else, which had always been her habit, and which she saw no reason to change. She made the building's communal coffee, because she was there, and no one else was, and she could not stand the idea of sitting in the kitchen doing nothing, while the water boiled. She arranged the chairs in the briefing room because 2 of them had been left at odd angles the day before. She organized the folders on the shelf outside the records room that had been gradually accumulating disorder for the past 2 weeks while people were distracted by the announcement. She liked the act of putting things in order. She always had. There was something in it that felt like a small, private act of control, a confirmation that the world could be made to make sense if you were willing to do the work of arranging it correctly. At 8:30, Marcus arrived and found the coffee already made and said, "Oh, perfect," with the uncomplicated delight of a young man who had not yet learned to look too carefully at the people around him for signs of how they were actually doing. At 9, Kara, the pack's senior events coordinator, arrived with an armful of folders and a look of cheerful, determined stress that Nadia recognized immediately as the face of a woman who was running 3 separate to-do lists inside her head and was managing all of them at once. Kara had been with the pack for 12 years and knew its workings the way a doctor knows a patient, thoroughly, and with the particular unsentimental fondness that comes from having seen someone through difficult seasons. "I'm going to need help with the seating arrangement," Kara said, dropping her armful on the nearest flat surface. "I have the border reports due by noon," Nadia said. "After noon, then." They looked at each other. Nadia had always liked Kara, specifically because Kara did not perform emotions she was not feeling. and did not expect other people to perform emotions they were not feeling either. She was the only person in the pack house who had looked at Nadia the morning after the announcement, with an expression that was not quite sympathy but was something adjacent to it. A brief, direct look that said, "I see you," and that's all it said, which was exactly the right amount. "Afternoon is fine," Nadia said. The morning was what mornings always were: reports, correspondence, 2 back-to-back calls with the neighboring Aldrin pack about the revised border protocol that had been in negotiation for the past month. Nadia handled both calls from her office with the door closed, took clear notes, sent a summary to Cale's assistant before lunch. She ate at her desk again. She told herself she would not make a habit of this. She went to help Kara with the seating at 1 o'clock. They spread the guest list across the large planning table in the events room, which smelled like old wood and the particular dusty warmth of a room that was only fully used a few times a year. Nadia had been in this room many times. She had helped plan the winter gathering here, the territorial summit from 3 years ago, the ceremony when the eastern boundary had been formally redrawn after the land negotiation. She knew this room. It felt strange to be using it for this. "Voss family on the east side," Kara said, not looking up from the chart. "We have 11 members confirmed from their line. The grandmother needs to be near the front. She doesn't hear well on the left side. What row do you have her in?" "Third. But Marcus put the Aldrin representative in the same row, and I think that's a terrible idea given what happened in the spring. Move the Aldrin rep to the 5th row, right center. Put Elder Wren's delegation between them so there's a natural buffer." Kara made a note. "Good. The center aisle needs to be clear all the way back for the procession. 12 feet minimum." They worked through it systematically. Nadia was good at this, at holding multiple variables in her mind at once, at anticipating where friction could arise and rearranging things before it did. She had always thought of large-scale planning as a kind of spatial logic, not unlike the territorial maps she worked with. Every element had a natural position. The job was finding it. She was midway through calculating the secondary viewing positions along the hall's eastern wall when Kara said, without looking up, "You don't have to come, you know." Nadia's pen stopped on the paper. "To the ceremony," Kara said. She was still looking at the guest chart. "I could put you on a legitimate scheduling conflict. Border report due that afternoon. It would not be unusual." The room was very quiet. Nadia thought about it honestly, about what it would feel like to not have to stand in that hall, about the relief that would be. And then she thought about what it would mean, about how it would read, to herself more than anyone else, to be the woman who could not manage to show up, who had to be protected from a room by a well-intentioned excuse. "I'll be there," she said. Kara nodded once and moved on without comment, and Nadia was grateful, specifically and deeply grateful, that she did not say anything else about it. That evening, Nadia did something she had been putting off for several days. She called her older sister, Lucy, who lived 3 territories away with her family, and who had an absolutely reliable instinct for the difference between a conversation Nadia was having and the conversation Nadia was actually having. Lucy picked up on the second ring. "You sound tired," Lucy said immediately, because she always did this. She always opened by reading straight through whatever Nadia had arranged on the surface. "I'm fine," Nadia said. It's been a busy week." "Okay," Lucy said. She did not push, which was the thing Nadia loved most about her. She waited. And Nadia told her. Not everything. She did not have words for all of it yet, and she was not sure all of it needed to be said out loud. But she told Lucy about the announcement. She told her about the ceremony. She told her about the invitation she had set on the counter and the coffee she had made in the empty building and the seating chart she had just spent the afternoon arranging for a ceremony that she still could not entirely believe was happening. Lucy listened through all of it. When Nadia finished, Lucy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes," Nadia said. "That's not what I asked." Nadia leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the last of the evening light was going out of the sky, leaving behind it a blue so dark it was almost black. "I don't know," she said. "I think so. I just need to get through the next few weeks. And then what? And then it will be done, and I can move on." "Move on to what?" "Lucy, I'm asking seriously. What does moving on look like for you? Where does it go?" It was a fair question. It was exactly the kind of question Nadia had been not asking herself, had been carefully steering around in all the early morning thinking sessions at the kitchen window. She did not have a good answer for it. She had been so focused on managing each individual day, on maintaining her composure and her professionalism and her appearance of being entirely fine, that she had not thought very much about what she actually wanted, what she was working toward, what came after the ceremony and the adjusting and the moving on. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. "That's actually fine," Lucy said. You don't have to know right now, but eventually you're going to have to decide what you want, Nadia. Not what works for everyone else, not what looks graceful from the outside. What you want. Nadia was quiet. You have this habit, Lucy said, and her voice was not unkind, of stepping aside for everyone else and calling it strength. I don't. You do. You've done it your whole life. You did it at home, you did it with the Northern Pack, and from what you're describing, you've been doing it here. Nadia did not argue. She thought about the mug on the counter, the chair not saved, the gatherings she heard about after, the gradual quiet removal of space that had taken the shape of something inevitable, something she had almost convinced herself was natural and fine. I just don't see what the alternative is, she said. The decision has been made. She's from a powerful family. It's good for the pack. What am I supposed to do? Make a scene? I'm not saying make a scene. I'm saying stop making it so easy for people to overlook you. Nadia thought about that for a long time after the call ended. She sat in her apartment in the dark because she had not turned a lamp on and she did not feel like moving yet. She thought about the phrase, stop making it so easy. She thought about all the ways she had, over the past 4 years, made it easy. Made it easy to take her work without crediting it. Made it easy to fill a room and then be moved to its edge. Made it easy for a situation to develop in which everyone around her assumed she was handling things well, because she always handled things well, and so no one thought to ask. She was not angry at them for assuming. She had given them every reason to. She was, perhaps, and this thought arrived slowly, as if from a long way off, more tired than she had admitted to herself. Not physically tired. Tired in the way that happens when you have been performing fine for long enough that you have forgotten what not performing feels like. She sat with that for a long time. The week before the ceremony moved like all the weeks had been moving lately. Too fast when she was busy, too slow when she was not. She attended 3 additional briefings. She finalized the border protocol documentation. She helped Kara with 2 more rounds of ceremony preparations because Kara had asked, and because saying yes was easier than saying no, and because the work itself kept her head busy. She saw Kale 3 times that week. Each time was in a professional context. 1 briefing, 1 corridor encounter where he nodded and she nodded. 1 meeting about the Aldrin negotiations where he asked her for a specific analysis and she gave it and he used it. And the meeting concluded. Each time she was professional and prepared, and showed exactly as much of herself as the situation called for. Each time she walked away and thought, fine, that was fine. She was not sure she believed it. The night before the ceremony, she sat at the table in her apartment with the cream envelope in front of her. She had kept it on the counter all this time, which she could not entirely explain. She did not particularly want it there, but she had not moved it either. She looked at her name on the envelope, written in the formal hand. She thought about what Lucy had said, about stepping aside and calling it strength. She thought about the 8 years she had spent building herself into someone of genuine value, not just performing capability, actually having it, knowing this territory better than most people who had been born here, understanding the politics and the relationships and the underlying currents of power with a precision that came from years of careful, unglamorous observation. She had given all of that freely and completely, and she had asked for very little in return. And she had told herself that was the right way to live. But perhaps there was a difference, she thought, between generosity and erasure, and perhaps she had been confusing them for some time. She put the envelope in the drawer of her side table. She did not sleep well that night, but she did sleep, a few fitful hours in the early morning, before the light came up. When the alarm went off at 6, she rose without hesitation. She made her tea. She stood at the window and watched the sun begin to recover the sky. She had already decided what she was wearing to the ceremony. The dark green dress she had bought 2 years ago for a pack summit and never worn again. It was not flashy. It was not intended to make a statement. It fit well, and it was appropriate, and she had always looked good in that particular shade of green, and that was enough of a reason. She showered. She dressed. She arranged her hair with the same care she always brought to things that mattered. She looked at herself in the mirror with the kind of honest, level gaze that she found easier to bring to everything except herself, and she thought, you are going to walk into that room. You are going to stand where you are supposed to stand. You are going to get through this with your head up. And then, she thought this quietly, not quite as a plan and not quite as a promise, but somewhere between the two. You are going to figure out what comes next. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She left. The gathering hall had been transformed. Nadia had been in this room dozens of times over the years, for pack assemblies and territorial councils and the long, difficult winter gathering 2 years ago, when half the pack had been ill with a persistent fever, and the Elder Council had sat in a tense circle for 4 hours debating quarantine protocols. She knew the grain of the wooden floor. She knew the way sound moved in it, bouncing off the high-beamed ceiling and arriving back a half-second late. She knew the particular smell of it, old stone and cedar and the dust of a room that had absorbed the weight of many difficult conversations. She did not quite recognize it tonight. White flowers covered every available surface, not just decorative arrangements on the tables. They had been trained up the stone columns, woven through the iron railings of the mezzanine, clustered at the base of every pillar until the stone itself seemed to be growing them. The lighting had been lowered and warm, and it caught the white petals in a way that made the room glow softly, as if the hall itself was lit from within. Round tables had been set along the periphery for after the ceremony. The center aisle was clear, exactly as the seating chart had specified, a 12-foot width of polished floor running from the main doors to the raised altar at the far end. Nadia had helped plan this. She had sat with Kara and measured chair spacings and calculated sight lines and argued in favor of the eastern sconce arrangement because she knew how the light behaved in this room at this hour. She had done all of this competently and without comment, and now she was standing in the result of that work, in her dark green dress, and the room was genuinely beautiful. She found her seat, 7th row, left of center. A good seat, objectively speaking. Clear sight line to the altar, close enough to see without being in the territory of the family sections or the Elder Council's reserved front rows. She had noted her own position on the chart without allowing herself to feel anything about it. Now she sat in it. The room was filling up. She recognized most of the faces, pack members she had worked alongside for years, senior staff she attended briefings with, several council elders she had prepared reports for. She nodded when she was nodded to. She smiled when she was smiled at. 3 different people told her she looked lovely, which she received with the exact amount of warmth the situation called for, and did not try to exceed. She watched the Voss family arrive, 11 members, as Kara had confirmed. They moved through the room with the particular ease of people who have never had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. The grandmother was assisted to her 3rd row seat by a young man who was clearly a grandson. She sat with the straight-back dignity of a woman who had seen a great many ceremonies and intended to outlast a great many more. Ilara arrived last, from a side entrance, and the room did something subtle when she entered, a shift in attention, a slight increase in the ambient noise that is the sound of many people reacting simultaneously. Nadia did not turn her head. She heard it and she felt it, and she kept her eyes on the front of the room. She was getting through this. That was the operating principle. The Elder Council filed in from the altar side entrance, 7 of them in the formal gray robes they wore for ceremonies of this kind. Elder Wren was at the front. He was the oldest of the council, and had the particular solemnity of a man who had been presiding over important events for so long that his presence had become its own kind of gravity. Nadia had worked with him on 3 separate council projects. She knew he took 3 sugars in his tea and had a fondness for old territorial maps that he kept rolled in his office behind his desk, and sometimes unrolled to show people with the energy of a much younger man sharing something delightful. The hall settled into quiet. Kale came in from the main entrance at the back, which meant he walked down the center aisle, which meant that if you were sitting in the 7th row, left of center, he passed within 8 feet of you. Nadia did not look up until he was nearly level with her row. She had told herself she would not do this, would keep her eyes forward, but the room's attention shifted and pulled, and she was human, and so she looked. He was dressed formally, dark clothing, the pack's crest on the left shoulder, no other ornamentation. He walked the way he always walked, which was with a measured, unhurried pace that somehow conveyed a complete absence of uncertainty. She had always noticed this about him, the way he moved through a room as if the room had been arranged around his presence rather than simply containing it. He did not look at her. Or, he did not look at her in the row-by-row way of a man scanning the crowd. But as he passed her seat, there was something, a slight difference in the angle of his gaze. Not a turn of the head, not a pause, just something that was not quite the same as the way he passed the 6th row, and the 5th row, and the 8th row. She was probably inventing this. She looked back at the altar. The ceremony began with Elder Wren's invocation, which was long and traditional and referenced the founding of the pack in terms that were both formal and, Nadia always thought, oddly moving, because they reminded you that you were part of something that had existed before you and would continue after you, which was either comforting or distressing depending on your present circumstances. Ilara entered from the left side entrance when the invocation reached its midpoint, which was the traditional moment. She wore something simple and white, and moved through the open aisle with the composed, steady grace of a woman who had been well prepared for this. The Voss grandmother nodded once from the third row, which was the most overt approval anyone from that family seemed to offer for anything. Nadia watched. She watched Alara reach the altar. She watched Kale turn to face her. She watched the two of them stand together at the raised stone platform while Elder Wren moved into the formal binding address, which was the section of the ceremony that laid out the responsibilities of the union, to the pack, to each other, to the ongoing work of the territory. She was fine. She was sitting in her seat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression composed, and she was fine. She noticed, almost as a separate and distant observation, that her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. She consciously relaxed them. She noticed that she was breathing shallower than usual, and she adjusted that too, quietly, and without drawing attention. She was managing this well. She was getting through it exactly as she had planned. The elder was midway through the binding address when it happened. Not something that announced itself. Not a sound or a movement that she would have predicted. What happened was this. Kale turned his head. Not toward Alara, toward the room. It was the briefest possible motion. Barely even a full turn. More like the beginning of a turn that almost immediately stopped itself. But it was enough. Enough to be visible, if you were watching carefully, if you happened to be seated at the angle that Nadia was seated at, 7 rows back and left of center. He was looking for something. She did not know this with certainty. She had no way of knowing it with certainty. But she had spent 4 years reading this man's attention in meetings and briefings and long strategy sessions, and she recognized the specific quality of that partial turn. The particular way it was not random. He was not looking at the room generally. He was oriented toward something specific. And then his gaze arrived at her row. For one moment that had no measurable duration, she looked directly at Kale Drayton, standing at the altar of his own mating ceremony, and he looked directly back at her. She felt something move through her that she could not have named in that moment, and would not be able to name for some time after. It was not triumph, and it was not grief, and it was not hope. Or if it was any of these things, it was all of them at once, packed so tightly together they were indistinguishable. She looked away. She looked back at Elder Wren, who was still speaking, whose voice had not changed, who had not noticed, because he was reading from the binding text and had not looked up from it. She looked at the white flowers on the nearest column. She looked at her hands, now still and composed again in her lap. The moment had passed. It was over. It was probably nothing. Elder Wren's voice paused at the end of a section. Silence. A different silence from the respectful quiet of the ceremony proceedings. This was the held-breath silence of a room that has felt something shift. Nadia noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature, not through any single sensation but through a general awareness that the atmosphere has changed. Elder Wren cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in that silence it was very audible. Alpha Drayton. Another pause, longer this time. Nadia looked up. Kale had stepped back from the altar. Not dramatically. 1 step, 2 steps, but enough. Enough to be unmistakable. He was no longer standing in position for the next section of the binding address. He had moved in a way that had no precedent in any ceremony that Nadia had ever attended, and she had attended many. The room was very still. Alara stood at the altar with an expression that Nadia, even from 7 rows back, could read as careful and composed and uncertain, all in the same breath. Elder Wren, Kale said. His voice was even. It was always even. She had never once heard it lose its steadiness, not in a difficult negotiation, not in a crisis, not in any of the hard moments she had witnessed in 4 years. He sounded, she thought distantly, exactly the same as he did in a briefing room at 11 o'clock in the morning when he had read a report and had a question about it. I need to pause the ceremony. The sound that went through the room was not a sound exactly. It was more like a change in pressure. Like the moment before a very large door opens. Elder Wren's expression did not change, which was a remarkable feat of composure. That is irregular, he said. I know, Kale said. Nadia's hands were very still in her lap. He was looking across the room again, not at Elder Wren, not at Alara. Across the rows of seated guests with the particular directed quality she knew, the attention he gave to things that genuinely mattered, until it landed in the 7th row, left of center. There is something I should have said, he said, before we reached this point. Nadia forgot how to breathe for approximately 5 seconds. Whatever she had prepared herself for in the weeks since the announcement, the composure she had built, the careful management of each day, the steady professional presence, the dark green dress, the folded hands, the 12 words of the boundary she had set for herself about what this day was and what it was not. None of it had prepared her for this. She was aware, in the way you are aware of the texture of the floor when your legs stop working reliably, that several hundred people in the room had just turned to see where Cale Drayton was looking. She was aware that the answer to that question was her. She stayed exactly where she was, still, back straight, hands in her lap. The room waited. She waited too, though what she was waiting for, she could not have said. Whatever came next, she was in it now. No one moved. That was the first thing Nadia registered clearly. Not sound, not color, not Cale's expression from across the room, but the absolute stillness of the hall. Several hundred people and not one of them moved. Not a rustle, not a cough. The kind of silence that a room produces when it is holding something it does not know what to do with yet. Cale walked. He came down the steps of the altar without looking down at them, which said something about the kind of man he was. The kind whose body knew where the ground was, who did not need to check. His footsteps on the polished floor were audible, because everything else was silent. Nadia heard them and counted them without meaning to. She counted 10 before she made herself stop. He walked the center aisle. He walked it in the same direction he had come, back through the seated rows, and the crowd parted for him in the way crowds part for someone who is moving with absolute certainty about where they are going. Nadia watched this happen from 7 rows back, left of center, and she felt something very strange occur in the region of her chest. A compression, like a breath she had been holding for a long time, was being slowly, cautiously released. He stopped at her row. He stood in the aisle beside the 7th row, left of center, and he looked at her. Not at the people on either side of her, not at the general vicinity, at her. The people seated between Nadia and the aisle, 2 pack members from the Border Patrol team, a woman from the records office named Petra who Nadia had always liked, shifted almost involuntarily, without deciding to, creating a small open passage. Nadia was not entirely sure this was intentional. She thought it might simply be what bodies did when an alpha of this magnitude stood 1 foot away and looked at a specific person. She looked back. There were approximately 10,000 things she could have done in this moment, and she had not prepared for a single one of them because she had not thought this moment was possible. She had thought about all the other moments, the grief of watching the ceremony, the managed dignity of her composed expression, the drive home afterward when she would finally be alone and could set down the weight she had been carrying, without putting it down in front of anyone. She had prepared for every version of this day except this one. His expression was, and she searched for the right word, unguarded. That was as close as she could get. Cale Drayton had a face that was naturally composed, naturally measured, and she had seen all the gradations of it over 4 years in 1,000 different contexts. She had seen it in difficult negotiations where the stakes were very high. She had seen it in the aftermath of a crisis on the eastern border when 3 pack members had been injured. She had seen it when he received good news, and when he received news that was not good, and the range between those expressions was always narrower than most people realized. What she was looking at now was none of those things. Nadia, he said. Just her name. She had heard him say her name hundreds of times, in briefings, in correspondence, in the corridor when he needed her attention. Her name in his voice was a professional, ordinary thing that she had learned long ago not to read meaning into. She was exceptionally good at not reading meaning into it. She was not sure she could do that right now. I owe you an explanation, he said. And then, because she was still not speaking, because she did not yet have access to words, he continued, I owe you more than one, but I'll start with the one I should have given you before today. The room was still not moving. She was aware of the hundreds of people behind and around them, of Elder Wren at the altar end of the hall with an expression she could not read from this distance, of Ilara standing where she had been standing and not having moved, of the Voss grandmother in the 3rd row who was watching all of this with the careful stillness of a woman who had lived long enough to see complicated things and had learned not to rush toward conclusions. She was aware of all of it, and she pushed it to the edges of her attention because Cale was speaking to her, and she needed to hear what he was saying. I made a decision in September, he said, about the Voss Alliance, about the direction of the pack. I made it the way I make most decisions, carefully, with all the information available to me, with a clear sense of what made sense for the territory. He paused. The problem is that I left out a significant piece of information. What piece? She said. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which was perhaps the consequence of 4 years of practice. You, he said. The compression in her chest became something else. She did not know what to call it. I left you out of the equation, he said. Not from the work. You were always in the work, always the clearest thinker in every room, always the one whose judgment I trusted most completely. I told myself that was enough, that it was a clean situation, that what I felt on the professional side of things was separate from the decision I was making on the other side. He stopped. He was watching her very carefully. I was wrong. Nadia looked at him. She had a very organized mind. She was good under pressure. She was good at holding complicated pieces of information and sorting through them to find the thing that mattered most. She tried to do this now and found that her usual ordering process had stopped working entirely, because the information arriving was not the kind that fit into any of her existing categories. "You're standing at your own ceremony," she said. "Yes." "You walked away from your own ceremony." "Yes." "Cale." She stopped. She had used his name without the formal prefix and it had come out completely naturally, and she was not going to think about that right now. 3 weeks ago this announcement was made. "I have spent 3 weeks. I know." "No, listen to me." Her voice was still steady, but something had moved underneath it. Something had shifted from composure toward an honesty she had not planned for but could not stop now. "I spent 3 weeks getting through this. I arranged myself to get through this. I built something very careful and functional around the fact of this day, and you are standing in the middle of my 7th row and I need you to understand what you are asking me to deal with right now, in this room, in front of all of these people." He did not look away. He did not flinch. And he did not retreat into the contained, measured face he wore when a conversation had reached its limits. He stood there, and he let her say it, and he held it. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made you spend those 3 weeks. I'm sorry I didn't see it, or that I saw it and didn't let myself understand what I was seeing, which might be worse." He stopped. "I am asking you to deal with an unreasonable amount right now. You are allowed to be angry about it." Nadia thought about what Lucy had said, about stepping aside and calling it strength, about making it easy for people to overlook her. She thought about the 8 years of work, the early mornings, the reports that were read and valued and then deprioritized, the chair not saved, the gatherings she heard about after, the long, careful construction of a gracious, composed woman who could watch this ceremony from the 7th row with her hands folded in her lap and her expression perfectly managed. She thought about all of it. "You should have talked to me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have. Before the announcement, before the invitation, before any of this was set. Yes, and instead you waited until the middle of your own ceremony. Yes." He did not add anything to this. He did not try to explain it further or soften it or provide context that would make it easier to hear. He let it sit exactly as it was, which was the particular form of honesty she had always, she realized now, with the specific clarity that comes when you stop managing your own responses, respected most about him. She looked at the floor for a moment. She looked at the polished wood and thought about the 8 years she had been standing on it and the future she had not yet figured out how to see. Then she looked up. "What do you want, Cale?" And he said her name again, all 3 syllables of it, the same way she had heard him say it in briefings and corridors and the ordinary exchanges of a professional relationship that had apparently been something else for longer than either of them had been willing to look at directly. "I want the equation to have the right numbers in it," he said. "I want to stop making decisions that leave out the most important variable." So behind him, several hundred people were very quietly not breathing. She became aware, in a distant, peripheral way, of Alara, who was still standing at the altar. She felt a complicated surge of something that was not quite guilt. She was not responsible for this, had not asked for it, had not known, but that was adjacent to it. The awareness of another woman standing in a position that was now, somehow, restructuring itself in real time. She looked past Cale toward the altar. Alara met her gaze. Alara's expression was, Nadia thought about this carefully, not what she would have predicted. It was not fury. It was not devastation. It was something more complex and more contained than either, the expression of a woman who was processing something at speed and doing it with a composure that Nadia had to acknowledge was impressive. Alara gave a very small, very deliberate nod. Just once. Nadia held it. She breathed. The room waited. Outside, somewhere past the stone walls and the white flowers and the amber warmth of the lowered lights, the night was doing what nights did, continuing, moving through its hours, unconcerned with what was happening inside this particular building on this particular evening. Inside, everything was absolutely still, and Nadia Cole, who had spent 3 weeks building a careful and functional structure around this day, who had pressed her best dress and arranged her hair and driven to this hall with her chin up, who had been good at getting through things for as long as she could remember, Nadia Cole exhaled. "All right," she said. It was not a grand pronouncement. It was not a declaration. It was 2 syllables in a steady voice, offered to a man who had just walked away from his own altar, and was standing in her row asking her to consider a different version of the day she had planned for. It was enough. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered to him, that particular focused stillness, and she looked back, and there was no performance in either of them now. There was only this room, and this moment, and all the things that were going to have to be addressed after it, which were many, and complicated, and could not be sorted in the next 5 minutes. But the next 5 minutes, these specific 5 minutes, right here, in the gathered hall with the white flowers and the silent crowd and Elder Wren at the far end holding his binding text and the Voss grandmother watching from the third row, these 5 minutes were done, and she was still standing. That was enough to start. The hall found its voice all at once, the way a wave finds the shore. For approximately 30 seconds after Nadia said the word "all right," the room held its silence. Then, as if the sound had been waiting just past the boundary of the moment, conversation erupted from every direction simultaneously. Not chaos, more like a dam releasing. The controlled pressure of several hundred people who had been holding a large amount of reaction in place, finally being permitted to put it down. Nadia heard none of the words specifically. It was ambient noise, human and confused and alive, washing up around the two of them as they stood in the 7th row. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, registering it without letting it reach you. Elder Wren had come down from the altar. He was crossing the floor with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had spent 7 decades declining to be hurried by anyone. He reached them in the aisle, and he looked at Cale, and he looked at Nadia, and his expression was the expression of a man who had seen difficult things, and complicated things, and had developed, over the long course of those 7 decades, a deep and unshakable commitment to finding the path through them. "This will require some discussion," Elder Wren said. He directed this at Cale in the manner of someone informing rather than objecting. "I know," Cale said. "Tomorrow morning, council chambers." "Yes." Elder Wren nodded once. Then he turned and made his way toward the altar end of the room, where the senior council members had collected in a cluster of gray robes and exchanged glances that Nadia could not read from this distance but that she suspected were complicated. Kara appeared at Nadia's left shoulder. She had come from somewhere in the crowd with the efficiency she applied to everything, and she touched Nadia's arm briefly, just a light, quick pressure, the kind that says "I'm here" and then moves on. And then she was already turning to manage the room, which was what Kara did in any situation. She managed things. Nadia was grateful for her in a sudden and specific way that she filed away to express properly at a later point. The room was not going to settle quickly. Nadia could see that. People were standing now, moving. The neat rows of ceremony seating dissolving into the kind of fluid clusters that form when an event has ended in a way no one prepared for. Several people were already looking in her direction, and she recognized the look because she had worn it herself in moments like this. The look of people trying to process something that had happened too fast for the usual categories to handle. Cale said quietly close to her, "We should move out of the center of this." "Yes," she said, which was her agreement on the single point of moving, and not on anything else yet, because there was a large amount of anything else still to be determined, and she was not in a position to determine any of it, while standing in the 7th row of the gathering hall, with what felt like the entire pack watching. They moved toward the side of the room, not together in the way that would have been a statement. He went first, and she followed at enough distance that the interpretation could have gone either way, which she thought was the correct approach for the next 10 minutes. She was very conscious of the Voss family in the room. She found a position near the eastern wall, beside the pillar closest to the secondary exit, which gave her something solid at her back and a clear line of sight to most of the room, and she stood there and breathed and let herself feel the full, strange weight of the past 20 minutes, without trying to manage it. Ilara had come down from the altar too. Nadia watched her cross the room with the same composed grace she had always moved with, and arrive at her grandmother's side, and sit beside the older woman, who took her hand without a word. Ilara did not look devastated. This continued to surprise Nadia, and she did not know what to do with it yet. Owen, one of the younger pack members from Cale's direct security team, materialized at a respectful distance from Nadia, and positioned himself there with the particular subtlety of someone who was keeping an eye on a situation without being asked to, and without making it obvious. She recognized this as a small kindness, and pretended not to notice it, which was the most gracious response she could think of. Marcus found her within 5 minutes, because Marcus always found whoever he was looking for within 5 minutes. He stood in front of her with an expression that was a precise mixture of relief and excitement and sincere concern, in proportions that were approximately 40, 40, and 20. She knew his face very well. He was a good young man who felt things very openly and had not yet learned to edit his reactions before they reached his face, which made him either endearing or exhausting depending on your current capacity. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, and then caught herself, because that was the automatic answer, and she was trying to be more honest about what the automatic answer was costing her. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm standing." He nodded vigorously, as if this was exactly the right answer. "You were incredible," he said. "The way you sat there the whole time and then and you just—" "Marcus." "Yeah? Give me a few minutes." He gave her a few minutes. He withdrew to approximately 6 feet away and stood there being supportive in a very energetic way that she found, paradoxically, comforting. The room continued to move around her. She watched it. This was something she was good at, watching a room, reading its energies, understanding the invisible currents of feeling and alliances and anxieties that move through any large group of people. She had done it in this very building many times. It was strange to be doing it now, in this context, with herself at the center of the thing she was watching. She saw Petra, from the records office, talking quietly and very seriously to 2 other women, all 3 of them glancing in different directions, which was the body language of people deciding something together rather than simply gossiping. She saw several of the elder council members in tight conference near the far pillar. She saw the Aldrin representative, whom she had relocated to the 5th row for diplomatic reasons just days ago, in what now felt like an event from a different life, standing alone with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had attended this ceremony as an observer and was now a witness to something considerably more significant. She saw Kale talking with Elder Wren and 2 of the senior council members at the edge of the altar area. He was listening more than speaking, which was usually how he operated in conversations that were going to require careful navigation. She watched him for a moment without meaning to and then looked away. Lucy called at 8:47. Nadia stepped out to the narrow side corridor and answered. "I heard," Lucy said immediately. "How could you possibly have heard?" "Nadia, there are people from 3 different packs in that room." "Right." She leaned against the stone wall of the corridor. It was cool through the back of her dress. "Okay. Tell me you're all right." "I don't know yet. I told Marcus the same thing. I think that might be where I'm living for a while." Lucy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm proud of you. I didn't do anything. You stayed in the room. You stayed in your seat. You let it happen and you didn't disappear and you didn't make it smaller than it was." A pause. "That's actually quite a lot." Nadia thought about the weeks of preparation, the composure she had built so carefully, the dark green dress and the arranged hair and the straight back and the folded hands. She thought about all the ways she had been ready for one version of this day, and about how entirely unprepared she had been for the version she had actually gotten. She thought about the way Kale had said her name. "There's going to be a lot to deal with," she said. "Starting tomorrow, the Council, the Voss Alliance, what this means for the pack. There are real political complications here." "I know," Lucy said, "but right now it's 8:47 at night, and you just survived something very large. Deal with the complications tomorrow." Surviving is not the same as having navigated it. "No, but it's the prerequisite." Lucy paused. "Go back inside. Don't disappear." "I wasn't going to disappear." "I know, I'm saying it anyway." She went back inside. The room had shifted into something looser and more informal. People were seated at the round tables now, and the ceremony's formal energy had dissolved into the kind of gathering that happens after something unexpected. There were drinks on the tables. There was quiet conversation. There was still a significant amount of eye contact directed at her when she re-entered, which she received with the composure she had been practicing for the past hour. She sat at one of the side tables with Kara and Owen and a senior pack member named Willa, who was 60 years old and had a reputation for saying what she thought, and who said now, to Nadia, without preamble, "Good for you." "I didn't do anything," Nadia said. "You stayed," Willa said. "When a person is the easiest one to remove from a situation, and the situation tries to remove her, and she stays, that's something." Nadia thought about this. "I was going to leave," she said. This was honest. After the ceremony, I had planned to stay for exactly as long as it was necessary, to be professional about it, and then to go home. But instead I'm sitting at this table at 9 o'clock on the night my life went sideways. Willa poured 2 glasses of water and slid one across the table. "That's where the interesting parts happen," she said. "The going home and being fine. That's not where anything changes. The sideways is where things get sorted." Nadia took the water. She drank it. She looked around the room, at the white flowers still climbing the stone columns, at the people talking in quiet clusters, At Elder Wren, who was seated with 3 council members and working through something in the focused, deliberate way of people who are getting ahead of a thing before it gets ahead of them. She looked at the altar, empty now. 3 weeks of planning in 1 hour, and everything was different. That was the uncomfortable truth of large events. They did not respect the structures you built around them. You could prepare and manage and compose and arrange, and the moment still arrived on its own terms and did what it wanted. She did not know what happened next. She had not known since the moment Cale stepped back from the altar, and she was still not entirely sure what had happened, or what it meant in any durable sense. And there were real and difficult conversations ahead that she was not going to be able to avoid or manage her way around. But she was in the room. She was at the table. She was not performing fine. She was not fine, not exactly, not yet. But she was present, which was the first requirement of anything that came after. That would have to be enough for tonight. She stayed for another hour. She spoke to the people who approached her with the warmth and the steadiness she had always brought to things, and she did not explain herself because she was not the one who had made a decision that required explanation, and she did not apologize because she had done nothing that required an apology, and she did not pretend that this evening had been easy or simple or anything other than what it was. When she finally stood to leave, it was past 10. The hall was still half full. The flowers had begun to drop small petals onto the floor, which had drifted slightly in the warmth of the room. Kara found her at the door. "The seating chart," Nadia said. "Forget the seating chart," Kara said. "Go home." Nadia went home. She hung up her coat. She took off her shoes. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall, and this time the wall looked different than it had the last time she had done this. She could not have said exactly how, but it did. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and she let the evening replay itself. Not to analyze it, not to break it down into its parts and arrange them in order of significance, but simply to let it move through her the way large events need to move before you can understand what they are. At some point in the early morning, without deciding to, she slept. She did not dream. Or if she did not remember it. Only the feeling of having slept, finally, without the particular weight of the past 3 weeks pressing down on every hour of the night. In the morning she would have to think about what came next. But morning was morning, and this was still tonight, and for now she let it be. The council meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Nadia received the official notice at 7:15, via a formal message slipped under her apartment door. She found it when she came back from the kitchen where she had already made her tea, and was now on her second cup. She read it standing in the hallway in her morning clothes, holding the cup in one hand and the notice in the other. Her presence was requested, not her presence specifically, as a named party. The meeting was called for senior staff and council members, which included her by virtue of her position. She was being summoned to the same room as everyone else. There was nothing in the notice that signaled she would be required to speak. She spent 45 minutes deciding what to wear, which was not something she normally did. She was usually efficient about this. She knew her wardrobe and what each item communicated, and she made her selection quickly and without second guessing. Today she stood in front of the small wardrobe in her bedroom and she thought about it carefully, because she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 4 years reading rooms for a living, that today was the kind of day where everything she did would be read. She chose a gray blazer and dark trousers, professional, unambiguous. The outfit of a person who was here to work, not to make a statement. She tied her hair back. She wore the small silver earrings she wore to everything that required precision. She arrived at the pack house at 8:40. She arrived first, which was what she always did, and she made the communal coffee, which was what she always did, and she arranged the chairs in the briefing room with her usual efficiency. She did all of this with a steadiness that was not performance. It was simply the fact that when she had a routine and she kept it, the rest of the day had somewhere to anchor itself. Marcus arrived at 8:55 with a face full of questions he was visibly restraining. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and restrained all the questions admirably. The council filed in at 8:58. 7 members, Elder Wren at the front, as always. They arranged themselves around the long table with the organized seriousness of people who had spent the night thinking about a situation and had arrived with positions already forming. Cale came in at 9 exactly. He looked, and Nadia assessed this with the same professional attention she would bring to reading anything important, like a man who had not slept much. The controlled, measured quality was still there. It was always there, but there was something different in the way he held it. Slightly more deliberate, the effort of it slightly more visible than usual. He looked at her when he came in, not for long. A second, maybe 2. She held the look with the calm neutrality she had been practicing. and then they both looked at the table. Elder Wren called the meeting to order. What followed was approximately 2 hours of the most organized and rigorous conversation Nadia had ever witnessed around a complicated situation, which was saying a great deal given that she had witnessed many. Elder Wren had the gift of conducting a difficult discussion in a way that was both completely clear and completely respectful of everyone in the room, and he deployed this gift now with his full attention. The questions were practical. The Voss alliance had been built around the political weight of a family line. That strategic need had not changed because the ceremony had been paused. What was the status of the Voss family's relationship with the pack? What did the pack's obligations look like now? What were the council's responsibilities regarding the Alpha's decisions in this area, and how did those responsibilities interact with the Alpha's personal authority? These were real questions with real consequences. Nadia listened to them being worked through and contributed, at 2 separate points, specific analysis she had prepared that was directly relevant to 2 of the questions: the Voss family's formal agreements with the pack, and the precedent from the territorial summit 3 years ago regarding alliance structures. Both contributions were received without comment on the context in which she was making them, which was exactly how it should work, and she was grateful to the council for that. Cale spoke mostly to the formal political questions. He was clear that the Voss alliance was still valued, and that he intended to maintain the pack's commitments to the family in every respect that did not require a personal binding. He said this directly and without hedging, and it had the quality of a decision already made, rather than a position being offered for discussion. He did not, in that meeting, say anything directly about Nadia, or about his decision the previous evening, or about the personal dimension of the situation. That was the right choice for this particular room on this particular morning, and she recognized it as such. She left the meeting at 11:15 and went to her office and sat behind her desk and exhaled for about 30 seconds, which was the length of time she permitted herself before pulling up the morning's correspondence. Kara came by at noon with a container of soup from the kitchen. "You didn't eat," Kara said. This was not a question. "I wasn't hungry this morning." "You're hungry now." Kara set the soup on Nadia's desk. "Also," she said, pulling up a chair, "Alara asked me to give you something." She produced a small envelope from her jacket pocket and placed it on the desk beside the soup. Nadia looked at the envelope. Her name was on it in a neat, careful hand. "She gave this to you this morning?" "She came to the pack house at 8. She asked if she could leave it for you." Kara paused. She seemed calm. Genuinely calm, not performed calm. "She asked me how you were doing." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the envelope. The note inside was short, 4 lines. It read, "I want you to know that I understood something before last night was over. What I saw in that room was not a situation that went wrong. I will not carry it as a wound. I ask you not to carry it as a guilt. What happens to us next belongs to us, separately and on our own terms. Yours, Alara." Nadia read it twice. She set it on the desk. She ate the soup. She thought, carefully and honestly, about Alara Voss, about the graceful, soft-spoken young woman who had arrived in this pack with her honey-dark hair and her careful note-taking, who had done nothing to earn resentment and had not, to Nadia's knowledge, sought anything she had not been offered, who had stood at the altar of a ceremony in front of several hundred people and watched a complication arrive, and had given a small, deliberate nod and then sat with her grandmother and held her composure and written 4 lines the next morning that were, in Nadia's honest assessment, generous beyond what was required. There were people, she thought, who you could not help but respect even when the situation made it inconvenient. She wrote back in the afternoon, 5 lines. She thanked Alara for the note, she said, with directness that she hoped landed as respect rather than distance, that she had not sought the previous evening's outcome and had not known it was coming. She said that Alara's composure had not gone unnoticed. She said that she hoped, with sincerity, that whatever came next for Alara would be equal to what she deserved. She left the note with Kara. At 3 in the afternoon, Cale came to her office. He knocked. He did not simply appear in the doorway, which was something he had occasionally done when something urgent needed her attention, and the corridor between his office and hers was the fastest route. Today he knocked, which told her he understood that they were in different territory now. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood rather than sitting, which was another tell. Standing meant the conversation had not yet found its settled form. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was almost casual, and therefore not entirely natural for him, and he looked at her desk, and then at her. "The council meeting went well," she said. "It did. You gave the right analysis on the Voss agreements. It was accurate." "Yes." He paused. "Nadia, you can sit," she said. He sat. He looked at her with the unguarded expression she had first seen on him the previous evening, which she was not sure she had a full category for yet. "I don't know exactly where to start," he said. "Start with what you need to say and I'll tell you when I need you to stop," she said. He considered this. "That's fair." Another pause. "I noticed you 3 months into your time here. Not professionally. Professionally I noticed immediately. Everyone did. But the other kind." He stopped. "I told myself it was not relevant. That the work mattered. And the rest of it didn't have a place in how I ran this pack. I was very committed to that position." "For how long?" 4 years, he said. She looked at him. "I was very committed to it," he said again. She breathed. "And then the Voss family arrived." "Yes. And the alliance made sense. Politically, structurally, for the pack's position in the territory. Everything about it made rational sense. And I convinced myself that rational sense was enough. That a man in my position could not afford to factor in things that were not rational. Things like what you felt. Yes. So you were going to marry Alara. Yes. While also, what? Continuing to think about me from across the room? It landed harder than she had intended, but she did not take it back, because it was what she was actually thinking, and she had decided she was going to say what she was actually thinking. He absorbed it. "Yes," he said, "which is not acceptable. I know it is not acceptable. I'm not offering it as a defense." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm trying to understand it." "The honest version," he said, "is that I didn't let myself understand what I was doing, until I was standing at the altar and looking at you in the 7th row, and understanding it very clearly, suddenly, and all at once." "That's very poor timing," she said. "Yes. It created a significant number of problems." "Yes. It was deeply inconvenient for Alara." "Yes. And it was deeply inconvenient for me," she said. "For the 3 weeks before it, while I was arranging myself to handle it, and then last night when I was not arranged for any of what happened. I know." He looked at the desk and then back at her. "I don't have a clean way to make that right. I can tell you I'm sorry, which is true, but it doesn't undo the weeks." "No," she said. "It doesn't." The room was quiet. She thought about what she wanted. The question Lucy had asked, the one she had been steering around. She let herself look at it squarely now, in this office, with this man sitting across from her. She thought about the work she had done here. The years of it. The commitment she had given to this pack and to the people in it. She thought about the specific and real pleasure she had always taken in doing difficult things well, in finding the right path through a complicated situation, in knowing a territory so thoroughly that she could see 3 moves ahead. She thought about how much of that she had done for its own sake, and how much she had done in proximity to a person she had never let herself think clearly about. "I want to do this correctly," she said finally, "whatever this is, between you and me and the work and all the other pieces. I want to do it in a way that I can look at honestly." "That's what I want too," he said. "Then we start there, and we go slowly, and we figure out as we go." "Yes. And you don't make decisions about things that involve me without telling me first." "I will not," he said. She held that. She held the shape of this new thing, the edges of it still rough and unclear, and she thought, this is not a resolution. This is the beginning of something that is going to take real time and real work to understand. The previous evening's drama was not the end of anything. It was the opening of a much more complicated chapter. She was not afraid of complicated. She had been managing complicated for a long time. "All right," she said. It was the second time she had said it to him in 18 hours. She thought about that briefly. She thought about how it had sounded both times. Not like surrender, not like agreement, but like the word she chose when she was ready to move forward. He stood to leave. At the door he paused. "The border report," he said. "I read it this morning. The analysis in Section 3 is exactly right." "I know," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know you know." He left. She sat in her office for a long moment after the door closed. Then she turned back to her desk, and she went back to work. The pack talked. Of course it did. A pack was a living thing, and like all living things it had a circulatory system, and in this pack that system was conversation, the informal kind, the kind that moved through kitchens and training fields and the common room on rainy afternoons. Nadia had always understood this. She had always been able to read the currents. She had read them for 4 years on behalf of a man who was good at many things but occasionally needed someone to tell him what was actually moving through the place he governed. She heard herself disgust. She had expected this. What she had not fully anticipated was the range of things she heard, which was considerably wider than she had predicted. She heard sympathy. She heard admiration. She heard from at least 3 separate sources in the first week, some version of the phrase she always knew he noticed her, delivered with the particular energy of people who are enjoying the satisfaction of a thing they privately suspected being confirmed. She heard, from a smaller number of sources, a version of this is going to be complicated, delivered with the wariness of people who understood political implications. She heard, once, from someone speaking in the corridor outside the records room in a voice not quite low enough, that this whole thing was very unfair to Alara and someone should say so. On that last point, Nadia agreed entirely. The Voss family's formal response arrived 6 days after the ceremony. It was addressed to the Elder Council, which was the correct protocol, and it was, from everything Nadia heard through official channels, extraordinarily measured. The family expressed no public anger. They reaffirmed their commitment to the existing territorial agreements. They requested a formal consultation, not a confrontation, a consultation, with the council to discuss the shape of the alliance going forward. The phrasing, Elder Wren told Nadia when he shared the contents with the relevant staff, was the work of people who understood that a measured response was more powerful than a furious one. The grandmother drafted it, Nadia said, because she was certain of this. Elder Wren looked at her with the expression of a man who was mildly impressed and declining to show it fully. Most likely, he said. She had been right. She did not say so, because she was trying to be better about the reflex to defend her own accuracy when no one had challenged it. Alara left the pact territory on day 8. She did not leave in a dramatic way. No formal goodbye ceremony. No tearful exit from the main gates. She simply was there, and then she was not. Kara, who knew everything that moved through the pack house, told Nadia that Alara had met with Kale privately the morning she left. The meeting was 40 minutes. Neither of them had discussed its contents. Nadia thought about those 40 minutes sometimes. She let herself think about them in the honest way she had been trying to think about difficult things, not managing or minimizing, but actually sitting with the discomfort of imagining 2 people across a table from each other, navigating something that should not have happened the way it had. She had said what she needed to say to Alara in the 5 lines of her note. She did not need to add anything to it, but she did not pretend either that nothing was owed, or that the previous night had not cost someone else something real. Work continued. This was perhaps the most stabilizing fact of the days that followed. The work did not stop for personal events, which was sometimes frustrating, and was right now, in this specific situation, a genuine relief. The border protocol still needed finalizing. The winter storage assessments needed attention. The Aldrin Pack had sent a follow-up query about the eastern boundary dispute that required careful, calibrated language in response, because Aldrin's senior representative had a tendency to interpret any ambiguity in writing as an invitation to expand his territorial claims, and Nadia had dealt with him enough times to know that precision was not optional. She worked. She did her job. She showed up at 9 in the morning and stayed until the work was done, and she was good at it, which she had always been good at it. But something was different now in the way it felt. Not the work itself, the frame around it. The thing she had been doing it for, or the thing she had been telling herself she was doing it for, had shifted in a way she was still working out. She had a conversation with Kale almost every day, professional ones, briefings, reports, the ongoing management of the pack's business. These were the same kinds of conversations they had always had. She noticed, after the first week, that they had gotten fractionally more direct, not warmer exactly. They had always had a directness that was its own form of warmth, but less edited. He no longer adjusted his questions before asking them, the way she had occasionally noticed him do before, as if recalibrating what he was about to say. He simply asked what he needed to know, and she answered, and they moved through the work. On the 11th day, he asked her to walk the eastern boundary with him. It was not an unusual request. He walked the boundary regularly, with rotating company from the senior staff. It was his way of staying connected to the actual physical territory, rather than only its administrative representation. She had walked portions of it with him twice before, in the early days of her time on his advisory staff. She knew the rhythm of these walks, practical, mostly quiet, punctuated by occasional specific observations that were never quite as casual as they sounded. They set out in the late morning, before the afternoon light got sharp. The eastern boundary ran along the ridge that marked the end of pack territory before the long, uninhabited stretch of the neutral zone. It was a different kind of cold up there, thinner than the valley, with a wind that had been traveling a long way before it arrived. She had worn sensible shoes and a coat she could move in. He had a habit of walking quickly, which she had remembered. They covered the first mile largely in silence, not uncomfortable silence, the kind that belongs to people who have worked closely enough that they don't need to fill air. She noted the condition of the boundary markers, 2 of which needed attention. She made a mental note, and then a physical one in the small notebook she always carried. He spoke when they reached the overlook, the point on the ridge where the neutral zone became visible, a wide stretch of bare lowland that belonged to no pack and was used by all of them. He stopped there the way he always stopped, looking out at it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right? What did you think about all of this? In the beginning, before the ceremony, before any of it, what were you actually thinking?" She considered the question. He had not asked how she felt. He had asked what she thought, which was the version of the question she could engage with most honestly. She looked out at the neutral zone. A bird of some kind moved in the far trees at the border of it, too distant to identify. "I thought," she said, "that I had built something significant here, and that it was being quietly set aside. I thought that I was expected to be gracious about that, and I mostly was, except at 4 in the morning when I wasn't." She paused. "I thought that the reasonable professional thing to do was to get through the ceremony and then figure out what came next. And the less reasonable part?" She was quiet for a moment. "The less reasonable part thought that it was very unfair. Not that you had made a different choice, you can make whatever choices you make, but that I had given everything I had to give to this work and to this place, and the shape of how that was seen had apparently been invisible to the people who should have seen it most clearly." He took this without defense. "I was one of those people," he said. "Yes? And I'm sorry for that specifically." He turned from the view to look at her, not just for how the ceremony went, for before. For the months of before, when you were sitting across from me in every meeting and I was doing a very thorough job of not acknowledging what was actually true. She looked back at him. The wind moved between them and she was aware of the long particular history of these 4 years. Not just the ceremonies and the crises, but the ordinary days. The 11 o'clock briefings, the margin notes on her reports, the small precise things that added up, over time, to a picture she had been very careful not to look at too directly. "What would you have done," she said, "if I had told you what I was doing before the ceremony?" He considered this with his usual seriousness. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'd like to say I would have stopped, made a different decision, but I don't know that." She respected this for its honesty. It was much easier to claim, after the fact, that you would have responded well to a truth you were not offered. "Then we're here," she said, "with the situation as it is." "Yes. And you have a council that is managing the consequences of a stopped ceremony." "Yes. And the Voss family, who are being extraordinary about something they had every right to be much louder about." "Yes. And a pack full of people who are processing a significant amount of unexpected information." "Yes." He looked at her with the direct, unguarded quality she was getting used to. "And I have you, on this ridge, in the situation as it is." She breathed. The wind was cold and clear, and the neutral zone lay in front of them, quiet and unheld. "I'm not easy," she said, "in case that was not clear from the past 11 days. I am not going to be gracious about things that are not gracious. I am going to say what I think in the rooms I am in. I am not going to arrange myself into corners so that other things fit more neatly." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually know it, not to say that you know it." "I actually know it," he said. "It is one of the things I should have been clearer about understanding 4 years ago. You are the clearest thinker in every room, and you do not come with a switch to turn that off, and I do not want one." She stood with that. Then she opened her notebook. "The boundary markers at post 7 and post 9 need attention. The post 9 one has been shifted from its original position, I'd estimate by weather, but it should be checked against the original survey marks." He took out his own notebook. They walked back. It was not a resolution, she reminded herself. It was not the end of anything complicated. There were real things to navigate: the council's ongoing work to stabilize the political fallout, the Voss family consultation that was scheduled for 2 weeks from now, the pack's opinion which was varied and not uniformly positive, her own internal landscape which was something she was going to need a great deal more time to fully understand. But on the ridge, on an ordinary autumn morning with the cold wind and the distant neutral zone, 2 people had told each other the truth. That was something. That was, she thought, walking down the far side of the ridge in silence, her notebook in her coat pocket, the boundary stretching ahead of them, exactly enough for an ordinary Thursday. She would take it. The Voss consultation happened on a gray Thursday, 3 weeks after the ceremony. It was not a small meeting. The Voss family sent 5 representatives, including the grandmother, whose name was Dorothea, and who arrived in a black car with a cane she held but did not appear to need, and who looked at the pack house with an expression that was neither approval nor disapproval, but something more thorough than either. 2 senior lawyers accompanied her, whose briefcases were newer than their faces suggested they should be. The other 2 representatives were family members whose precise relationship to the main line Nadia had noted in her pre-meeting research and set aside as less important than the temperament they were likely to bring. Nadia had done the preparation for this meeting. Cale had asked her to. She had not felt the need to discuss whether this was appropriate, and he had not offered to discuss it, which was either a sign that they had reached a functional understanding, or a sign that they were both moving carefully around a conversation they were not ready for. She had accepted the assignment, prepared the documentation, and briefed the council members individually the morning before. She was not in the meeting itself. This was the correct decision. She understood this. Her presence in the room would have introduced a dimension to the conversation that did not belong in a political consultation, and she had said as much to Elder Wren when he asked her view on attendees. He had listened and agreed, and she had been pleased to find that she could be clear-eyed about it rather than defensive. She sat in her office and worked through the morning while the meeting happened 40 feet away. At 12:15, Marcus came to get her for lunch and found her staring at a border document she had read 3 times without retaining. "You're thinking about the meeting," he said. "I'm reading the border document," she said. "You've been on the same page for 40 minutes. She looked at the page. She looked at Marcus. She put the document down. "Fine," she said. "Let's go eat." They went to the smaller kitchen on the ground floor, which was usually quieter than the main common room at lunchtime. Nadia made a sandwich and sat at the table and ate it in the way she had been trying to eat recently, which was actually tasting things rather than simply consuming them in the general direction of being less hungry. It was a newer habit, and she was still working on it. "How are you actually doing?" Marcus asked. He had asked her this question with some variation of wording every 3 days for the past 3 weeks, with the persistence of a young man who was genuinely concerned and who also, she suspected, was keeping himself from more intrusive questions by channeling his concern into this one acceptable form. "Better," she said, which was true. "Different." Different how? She thought about how to answer this honestly without requiring Marcus to process more than was fair to ask of him on a Tuesday lunchtime. "I think I spent a long time being the version of myself that was most useful to other people," she said, "and I'm figuring out what the version that's useful to me looks like." Marcus considered this. "That sounds hard," he said. "It's a bit," she said. "Is it also good?" She thought about the ridge walk. She thought about the conversation with Cale, the way it had felt to say what she actually thought without editing at first. She thought about the note from Alara, which she had put in the top drawer of her desk and had taken out twice to read again. She thought about the long-ago morning with the cold tea and the strange mug on the counter, which now felt like the opening of a story she had not understood she was inside until she was deep in the middle of it. "Yes," she said. "It's also good." The Voss consultation ended at 2:30. Elder Wren came to find her in her office afterward. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which he rarely did. He was usually in motion, conducting his business on his feet, and the act of sitting meant something when he chose it. "The meeting went well," he said. "Tell me." "Dorothea Voss is an exceptional woman," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that she recognized as one expert's assessment of another. "She came to the table without theater. She made clear that the family's political relationships with this pack existed independently of the personal question, and that she intended them to remain so. She asked for 2 things: a formal acknowledgement in the pack record that the alliance was restructured rather than dissolved, which preserves the family's standing, and a direct conversation with the Alpha about the future shape of the relationship. Did she get them? The first, yes. The second, Cale will speak with her tomorrow morning. Nadia nodded. She asked about you, Elder Wren said. She looked up. Not confrontationally, he said. She asked who had prepared the documentation for the meeting. When I told her, she said, he paused, recalling it. She said that clearly someone in this pack understood the value of doing difficult work well. Nadia sat with that for a moment. She's formidable, she said. Yes, Elder Wren agreed. I am very glad she is not angry with us. He left. Nadia sat with the afternoon settling around her and thought about Dorothea Voss, who had come to a difficult meeting in a place that had treated her family carelessly, and had chosen to be precise and strategic rather than wounded, and who had taken one moment to notice who had done the preparation, and to say so clearly. She thought, there are more ways to be a powerful woman than I have been giving myself access to. She wrote that down in the small notebook, because she had a habit of writing down things that were true before she lost them. The following week brought a new complication, which was perhaps not surprising given that the previous 3 weeks had been defined by a generally elevated level of complication. The Aldrin Pack's senior representative, whose name was Duncan and who had the reliable instincts of a man who watched power dynamics closely and moved quickly when he saw an opportunity, sent a formal request through proper channels asking for a meeting with the Ashford Alpha on the Eastern Boundary question. This was normal. What was not normal was the accompanying note, sent separately through slightly less official channels, which arrived on Cale's desk and was forwarded to Nadia because it was her area. The note suggested that the Aldrin Pack would find it productive to work directly with the individual who had prepared the most recent border analysis and named her specifically. She read the note twice. She brought it to Cale. He read it and set it on the desk. "Duncan is fishing," he said. "Yes, he wants to know if the disruption here has weakened our negotiating position. And he thinks he can assess that by getting you in the room. He thinks that if he can read how things stand between this office and me, he'll know how much room he has to push on the Eastern claim." She paused. "He's not wrong that it's a smart approach. What do you recommend?" She had already thought this through. Send him a formal response accepting the meeting, with the boundary analysis team present, including me. Don't make my attendance a special condition. Make it a straightforward business meeting. It removes the diagnostic value of my presence. I'm just there because I'm senior staff, not because there's something to prove. Cale looked at her the way he did when she had given him the analysis he had already arrived at and was checking his own thinking against it. "Yes," he said. "That's right. Also," she said, "we should tighten the language in the Eastern Boundary section before the meeting. There are 2 places where the current phrasing could be read as openings that we don't intend." "Show me." She showed him. They worked through it together, which was one of the things she had always liked best about working with him. The way a genuine thinking conversation moved between them, quick and precise, each building on what the other had offered, back and forth until the thing in question was better than either of them had made it alone. At some point in the middle of discussing the 3rd revision of a particular paragraph, she realized she was enjoying herself, not in a complicated way, not in a way that required analysis or came with a footnote, simply enjoying the specific pleasure of doing difficult work with someone who was good at it. She had missed this, she realized, not the 4 years of managed performance and careful composure. This specific thing. This back and forth. She had had it in the early days, before everything had gotten tangled, and she had not understood clearly what she was missing until she was getting it back. "You're smiling," Cale said. "We fixed the paragraph," she said. "We did," he agreed. And he looked at her with the particular quality she was still getting used to, the one that was not guarded and not measured, and that she was beginning to understand was simply what he looked like when he was not performing any form of composure. She looked back. No performance. No management. No careful architecture. Just her, and the work, and the man across the desk who had made a very serious mistake, and was doing the serious work of making it matter by doing better. "The Aldrin meeting should be next Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She gathered her materials and stood to leave. At the door she paused. It was the first time she had been the one to pause at the door. It occurred to her, briefly, that there was something slightly satisfying about that. "Cale," she said. He looked up. "The meeting on Thursday. I'll need the updated survey maps from post 7 and 9. The maintenance team completed the repairs, but I want the confirmed readings on record before Duncan sees anything." "I'll have them before Wednesday morning," he said. She nodded and left. She walked back to her office in the late afternoon light that came through the hall windows in long gold angles at this hour, the kind of light that made ordinary things look briefly significant. She sat at her desk. She picked up the notebook. She looked at what she had written. "There are more ways to be a powerful woman than I have been giving myself access to." She thought about Dorothea Voss with her cane and her exceptional composure. She thought about Alara and her 4 lines. She thought about Kara with her soup container and her brief, precise arm touch in a difficult moment. She thought about Lucy, who had said step aside and call it strength, and had not let Nadia argue her way out of hearing it. She thought about herself, in the 7th row, sitting absolutely still while the room rearranged itself around her. She wrote, below the first line, "You are already learning." She closed the notebook. She went back to the border document. This time she read it, and she retained what she read, and when she found the section that needed revision, she marked it clearly, and began drafting the better version, with the quiet, focused efficiency of a woman who knew what she was doing, and was no longer apologizing for how well she did it. The Aldrin meeting was supposed to be straightforward. It was not straightforward. Duncan arrived on Thursday with 4 members of his team and an air of cheerful professionalism that Nadia recognized immediately as the particular energy of a man who had spent the journey over deciding on his approach and was now deploying it. He was mid-50s, heavy-set, with a way of occupying a chair that suggested he was always more comfortable in rooms he had chosen than in rooms he had been invited to. He shook hands with everyone and made appropriate comments and accepted the coffee Marcus brought and sat down at the conference table with the expression of a man ready to conduct business. He spent the first 20 minutes being correct. He referenced the existing boundary agreements accurately. He asked reasonable questions about the Eastern markers. He listened to the answers with the attentive patience of someone who has prepared well and is confirming what he already expected. Then he said, to Nadia specifically, "Your analysis of the neutral zone corridor in the last report was interesting. I had some questions about the methodology." She had prepared for this. She had known he would do something of this kind. "Of course," she said. "Which section?" "The second half of Section 4, the assessment of the usable boundary width." He smiled in the pleasant, practiced way of a negotiator. "You've measured it differently from the previous survey." "The previous survey used an outdated reference point," she said. Post 9 had shifted. "We confirmed this when we did the physical review last month." "Shifted to whose advantage?" he said. The smile stayed in place. The room held its weight for a beat. "The physical facts don't take sides," she said. The marker moved. "We corrected the record. The resulting measurement is accurate." Duncan looked at her with an expression she read as both assessment and a slight, involuntary revision upward. He had come expecting to find a weakened position, or a distracted one, or some trace of the internal disruption he had heard about. She was not giving him any of it. "I'd like to see the raw survey data," he said. "Of course. I'll have it sent to your team by end of day Friday." She paused. "I'd also like to draw your attention to the appendix you may have skipped, which contains the measurement history from the original founding survey forward. The corridor's boundaries have been consistent on our side across every remeasurement." He blinked briefly, which was a very small reaction but one that told her he had not read the appendix. She had known he had not read the appendix. Cale said from his position at the head of the table, very evenly, "Nadia's analysis is the standard we work from. I'd recommend your team study the full document before the follow-up." It was a quiet statement. It was not a confrontation. It was simply the alpha of this pack indicating whose work he trusted, without theater, in a room where someone had tried to create the impression that things were uncertain here. Duncan shifted his approach. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. It ended with 3 specific next steps, all of which Nadia had anticipated in her preparation notes, and with a clear map of the territory that did not give Duncan anything he had not already had. She walked out of the conference room with the particular settled feeling that comes when you have done a difficult thing correctly. Marcus was waiting outside with a very contained expression that meant he was extremely pleased and was being professional about it. "You were incredible," he said. "We got the work done," she said. "He was trying to find a crack," Marcus said. "He couldn't." "There wasn't one to find," she said, which was simply true. But she thought about it on the way back to her office. She thought about the cracks Duncan had been looking for, the evidence of disarray, of a position undermined by personal disruption, of a pack whose internal order had been shaken. She thought about what he would have found if he had arrived 2 months ago, before the ceremony, when she had been managing her 3 weeks of careful composure and could not have walked into a room with that kind of steadiness. The difference, she thought, was not the event. The event had been difficult. The difference was what had come after the event. The decision, somewhere in those early morning hours after the ceremony, to stop performing fine and start being honest about what was actually happening. The decision to hold Cale accountable without softening it for his comfort. The decision to accept what Alara had offered rather than flinching away from it. The decision to say to Marcus, in the kitchen, that things were better and also different, which was the most accurate thing she had managed in weeks. She had been, in those decisions, very slightly more herself than she had been before. And that, it turned out, made her harder to crack. Lucy came to visit the following weekend. She arrived on Saturday morning with one bag and the particular energy she always had, which was the energy of a person who was fully present wherever she was. She had driven 4 hours. She did not complain about the drive. She looked at Nadia when she came in the door and she did not say anything for a moment, just looked, the way she always did when she was reading the actual state of things, rather than the stated one. "You look different," Lucy said. "I'm the same," Nadia said. "You look better. Come in and have tea." They had tea at Nadia's kitchen table, the small one she had always meant to replace with something larger and never had, because the small one was exactly the right size for one person eating alone, and she had gotten used to that, and now she was used to it, and now, she thought about this briefly, perhaps she would get used to something different. She told Lucy about the Aldrin meeting. She told her about the Voss consultation, about Dorothea, about the 4 lines from Alara. About the ridge walk with Cale. She told it all in the direct, economical way that had always been their shared language, the two of them, and Lucy listened in the same direct, economical way. And when Nadia finished, Lucy said, "And? And what? And where does it go now? With him?" Nadia looked at her tea. "Carefully," she said. "It goes carefully. We are in the same place professionally, and we have acknowledged the personal dimension, and we are not pretending it isn't there. But there's a lot of ground between acknowledging something and anything else. Are you afraid?" Nadia thought about this honestly. "I'm cautious," she said, "which is different." "Is it?" "Yes. Fear is what kept me sitting in the 7th row arranging myself to get through something without breaking. Caution is what keeps me moving toward the right version of something rather than the fast version." Lucy looked at her for a long moment. "That's a real distinction," she said. "You've been thinking about it." "A lot of early mornings," Nadia said. "You look like you slept." "I've been sleeping better." Lucy smiled, which she did not always. She was not a person who smiled as punctuation, which meant that when she did it meant something. "Good," she said. They walked in the afternoon, through the packed territory's outer paths, which were empty this time of year because the weather had committed fully to winter. The trees were bare and the sky was white, and the cold had the specific quality of early December in high country. Not vicious but total, the kind that means business. Nadia had layers on. Lucy had borrowed a coat from the hook by the door. "There is something I haven't said," Lucy said, as they rounded the far curve of the eastern path. "Tell me. I'm glad it happened, the whole thing." She paused. "Not because it was easy, I know it wasn't, but because the version of you that was sitting in that 7th row, managing everything and giving everyone your best and calling it enough, that wasn't all of you." She stopped walking briefly, and when Nadia stopped too, she looked at her. "This is more of you." Nadia thought about 8 years. She thought about the quiet morning after the mating announcement when she had sat at her desk and pressed her finger to the smooth patch on the oak surface. She thought about all the early morning hours at the kitchen window when she had told herself that one more day was enough. She thought about the ridge, the neutral zone, the survey maps and the border reports, and the revised paragraph in the eastern boundary documentation. She thought about Cale's face when he had looked up from the paragraph and she had already been smiling. "Yes," she said, "I think you're right." They walked back in the white winter light. The cold moved through them without malice, just weather, just the season doing what the season did. Nadia went to work the following Monday with the same quiet punctuality she had always maintained. She made the coffee. She arranged the chairs. She sat at her desk and opened the morning's correspondence and read it with the focused, retaining attention she had been bringing to everything lately. There was a meeting at 11. She walked in at 10:58 and sat in her usual chair, and Cale sat down at 9 and, she noticed, left the chair beside her, which was the chair Marcus usually occupied, empty. Marcus sat one seat over without comment, which meant Cale had said something to him, which was itself a statement of a particular kind, small and quiet, and placed there with intention. She did not make a production of it, she simply registered it and moved on into the work. At 11:41, after the meeting had concluded and people were filing out and she was gathering her materials, Cale said, quietly beside her, "Are you free this evening?" "Professionally or otherwise," she said. "Otherwise," he said, without hesitation. She thought about the caution she had described to Lucy, the difference between fear and care, the right version of something rather than the fast one. 6 o'clock, she said, "and you're making dinner." Something moved across his face that was the briefest version of the expression she had decided she was no longer going to pretend she didn't notice. "Yes," he said. She gathered her materials and walked out, down the corridor with the gold afternoon light coming through the windows, past the records room and the small kitchen and the notice board with the winter schedule pinned to it that she had organized last Tuesday and which was, she noted, still exactly right. Outside the building, the sky was a clear, cold blue, the kind that came after the first proper freeze, when the air had been washed clean of everything uncertain. She stood in it for a moment, hands in her coat pockets, looking up at the particular quality of winter light on bare trees. She had not known, 8 years ago, when she had arrived in this territory with 2 bags and a letter that called her capable and not likely to cause problems, what any of this would become. She had not known the shape of the country she was entering. You never did. You arrived, and you worked, and you gave what you had, and somewhere in the giving you became something you had not known you were going to be. She was not finished, not at the end of anything. She was, she thought, accurately and without performance, at the beginning of the version she had been building toward without the vocabulary to name it. She was fine. Actually fine, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count. She went back inside. There was still half an afternoon of work, and she was going to do it well. 6 o'clock arrived the way things do when you have decided not to manage your anxiety about them, simply and without drama. Nadia walked to the Alpha residence on the north side of the Packhouse complex. She had been there before in professional contexts, for strategy sessions when the situation required privacy, for 2 meetings with visiting PAC representatives whose status required a more formal setting. She knew the building. She had never before walked to it at 6 in the evening with the particular awareness that this was a different kind of visit. She wore the same gray blazer she had worn to the council meeting, because she had decided she was not going to perform for this either. She was not going to dress for an occasion she did not yet know the shape of. She was going to arrive as herself, exactly as she was on an ordinary Thursday in December, and that was going to be enough or it was not, and either answer was one she could live with. She knocked. Cale opened the door with a dish towel over one shoulder, which was one of the stranger things she had seen in 4 years of knowing him and which made her laugh, a brief, real laugh that arrived before she could decide to manage it. "I said you were making dinner," she said. "I'm making dinner," he said, moving back to let her in. "I did not say I knew what I was doing." The residence was warmer than the outside. It smelled like something cooking. She identified garlic and something roasting in an oven, and the overlapping warm complexity of a kitchen that has been in use for a while. The main room was large, with a wide window that looked out over the eastern tree line. A fire was going. The fire was the only considered thing about the room. Everything else had the comfortable disorder of a space that was actually lived in, not arranged for visitors. "You lit the fire on purpose," she said. "It's December," he said. "You knew I would notice." He looked at her with the expression that was becoming familiar. "Yes," he said. "I knew you would notice." She sat in the chair nearest the window. She looked at the tree line, dark against a darker sky, and she looked at the fire, and she looked at her own hands in her lap, which were not folded in the careful composure position of the 7th row but simply resting, loose, the way hands rest when they are not performing anything. "Tell me how the evening debrief on the Aldrin meeting went," she said. "I haven't seen the formal notes yet." He spoke from the kitchen. She heard the controlled noise of pots and utensils. He told her about the post-meeting consultation with Elder Wren, about the 2 items Duncan had raised through official channels in the aftermath that needed tracking, about the plan for the follow-up survey documentation. She listened and responded, and they worked through it the way they always worked through things, and it was ordinary and comfortable, and exactly the kind of conversation she had been having with him for 4 years, except that she was sitting in his residence next to a fire while he made dinner, and neither of them was pretending this was the same as a briefing room. He came out of the kitchen after a while and set 2 plates on the small table near the window. "What is it?" she said. "Roasted chicken, I think." "You think?" It looked like the photographs. She sat at the table. She looked at the plate. The chicken was fine. The roasted vegetables beside it were fine. It was the cooking of a competent person who did not cook often, and had put in genuine effort, which was exactly what it appeared to be and which she found, for reasons she did not stop to analyze, much better than a polished result would have been. She ate. He ate. They did not talk continuously through the meal. There were silences that were not uncomfortable. She had always found that the silences between 2 people told you as much as the conversations, whether they needed to be filled, whether they were restful, whether they had the particular quality of 2 people who were genuinely comfortable in the same room. These silences were restful. "I want to ask you something," she said, about halfway through the meal, "and I want you to answer it honestly, even if you don't think I'll like the answer." "Yes," he said. "When did you know? Before the ceremony, I mean. How long had you known?" He considered this the way he considered things that required accuracy. "I knew clearly when I was walking the center aisle," he said, "but that was only the point at which I could not avoid knowing. If you're asking when I actually knew," he stopped. "A long time." "How long?" "Longer than I have a clean answer for," he said. 2 years perhaps, in a form that I kept, putting somewhere." He looked at her. "I was not honest with myself about it. Which is different from not knowing. I think I knew, and I was very committed to not understanding what I knew." "Why?" "Because you were the clearest and most important person in my professional life, and I had decided those 2 categories didn't overlap, that a man in my position couldn't allow them to. And then a political alliance arrived and resolved the problem for you." "Yes, or so I thought. Until you were at the altar." "Yes." She sat with this. The fire was warm across the room. Outside the window the night had settled fully over the tree line, and the sky above the trees was the deep clear black of winter with a scattering of very bright stars. "I was angry at you," she said. "In the weeks before the ceremony, I didn't have a clean reason that I could justify to anyone, because you had not made me any promises and had not done anything that was technically wrong. But I was angry. You had every right to be." "Yes," she said. "I did. I just didn't know that. I kept telling myself I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You spent 4 years being very careful not to feel anything that wasn't professionally justifiable." She looked at him. "I saw it," he said. "I saw you doing it, and I understood it because I was doing exactly the same thing. We were both being very responsible and very professional, and neither of us was being entirely honest." She thought about this. About 2 people in the same building, attending the same meetings, reading the same reports, having the same clear-eyed professional conversations, and both of them carrying something unacknowledged in the background of all of it, like a piece of furniture you walk around for so long you stop seeing it. "We were both very good at it," she said. "Yes. And then you stopped." "And then I could not continue," he said, which is a slightly different version of stopping. She smiled at that. "Yes," she said. "It is." After dinner she helped with the dishes, not because she needed to and not because he asked her to, but because she was there, and the dishes needed doing. He washed and she dried, which was an arrangement they arrived at without discussing it, and which made the kitchen feel companionably small. He talked about the PAC's winter planning. She told him about the revision she had made to the Eastern Boundary Protocol language, the one that closed the gap Duncan had been probing. He told her about a conversation with the Northern Aldrin liaison that had happened 3 months ago, and that he had wanted to tell her about at the time and had not. She told him she had figured out approximately what he had been thinking in that meeting from the meeting notes, which had made him look at her with the fractional expression she was cataloging and storing. At 8:30 she put on her coat. They stood at the door. The fire had burned down to a lower, steadier warmth. Outside, the night was very quiet and very cold. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "The vegetables were overcooked," he said. "They were fine," she said. He looked at her. No composure, no management, just the face of a man who had made a serious mistake and had not tried to make it smaller than it was, and who was standing in the door of his own home at 8:30 on a Thursday night, next to a fire that had been lit on purpose. She stepped forward and she kissed him. Brief, deliberate, the kind that does not ask a question but answers one. Then she stepped back. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he agreed. She walked home through the cold. The path was lit at intervals by the low PAC house lights, and the night was clear enough that the stars she had seen through his window were visible above the tree line. She walked at her usual pace, which was not slow, and she did not think about anything in particular. Or rather, she thought about all of it at once, the whole particular year of it, in the way you think about a landscape rather than a map, taking it in rather than analyzing it. The thing she arrived at by the time she was turning the key in her apartment door was simpler than she expected. She had spent a long time being the version of herself that other people's needs had shaped. Not maliciously, no one had made her do it, and she had not done it without purpose. She had built genuine skills and genuine value, and a life that was real, but the frame around it had been, for a long time, primarily about being useful to other people, rather than about being fully present in her own life. She was not finished with being useful. She was good at it and she liked it, and it was a genuine part of who she was. But she was also, it turned out, allowed to want things. She put the kettle on. She changed out of the blazer. She sat at the kitchen table in the warm, small apartment, with the tea brewing and the familiar late-night quiet of the place, and she let herself feel good about it. This specific evening, the food and the dishes and the fire and the door and the cold walk home. She let herself feel it without immediately moving to the next thing, which was a newer habit and still required effort. She thought about Sunday. The kettle clicked off. She poured her tea and she sat with it, and she thought about all the mornings she had stood at this window in the gray early light, making herself be fine. She thought about how the distance between managing to be fine and actually being fine had felt, for a long time, so narrow that it seemed dishonest to name the gap. And she thought about how, at some point in the past months, without a ceremony marking the moment, the gap had closed. Not because anything had been resolved, not because every question had been answered, or every complication sorted, or the complicated things made simple. The gap had closed because she had stopped filling it with performance, because she had said what she meant in the rooms she was in, because she had allowed what was real to be real, even when it was expensive. She was not done being complicated. She was not done with the work, or the PAC, or the ongoing navigation of a life that had several moving parts and no guaranteed outcomes. She was not even done being cautious. Cautious, she had told Lucy, was the right word, the right version over the fast version. But she was, for the first time in a very long time, not managing her way through her own life. She was living it. She finished her tea. She washed the mug. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, without the 4 a.m. wakefulness and the standing at the window and the repeating of words she did not entirely believe. She lay in the dark with the pleasant ordinary weight of a good evening, and she slept. In the morning she woke up before her alarm. Not the anxious waking of the past months. The sudden, unwanted return to consciousness before 5. This was the quiet, easy waking of a person who has slept deeply and is simply finished sleeping. She made tea. She stood at the window. The gray light was coming up over the tree line in the way it always did at this hour, recovering the sky from the night with the unhurried patience of something that had been doing this for a long time and had not once needed to convince itself to continue. She looked at it. She was not performing anything. She was not managing anything. She was a woman standing in her kitchen at 6 in the morning, drinking tea, watching the light come back, thinking about her work and the council meeting Tuesday, and the revised border documentation, and the dinner on Sunday that she was looking forward to, with a directness she no longer saw any reason to edit. This was her life. It was good. She drank her tea. She got dressed. She went to work.